asking gamers what their favorite Final Fantasy game is, there are usually some patterns. Ask anyone who grew up playing the games on a PlayStation, and almost always Final Fantasy VII will be mentioned. However, ask someone who has played on the Super Nintendo, and they'll probably say either Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy VI. Now the problem with a lot of the PlayStation-era Final Fantasy games is that they're just re-released on other consoles. From Steam to the PlayStation Store, Final Fantasy VII still exists only in one form. Yet the great thing about classic Final Fantasy games is that there are multiple versions with new content, updated graphics, and adjusted gameplay. I'm going to be looking at all the versions of Final Fantasy IV due to the abundance of remakes and updates. Cecil's first adventure into a world he thought he understood happened on the Super Nintendo. As most fans of this game already know, the game's title at the time was Final Fantasy II, as Westerners didn't receive the other NES games. This could have been due to the fact that the original Final Fantasy wasn't shipped overseas until it had been a commercial success in Japan. So while the West was being awed with a complex story and customizable characters, Japanese players were already playing new installments. There also could have been some tension between the West publishers and Square due to another RPG they made, Tom Sawyer, a game that keeps the racist overtones from the original novel. But enough about the number change. Final Fantasy IV arrived to make a huge splash. A revolutionary concept at the time, the active time battle system appeared and would stay a major part of the franchise for future installments, for better or worse. This battle system was utilized in ways that made the many battles feel faster and required more active engagement to win. Not only were Western gamers enjoying battles in a new way, but this was the first time Final Fantasy tried to tell them a unique story with complex characters. Each character has their own predetermined class and set of skills. A few of these characters even learn new skills throughout the story, but what was fascinating was that those characters now had depth. There's a lot to be said about the general story of Final Fantasy IV, but I'll save out on those details, as it would take a lot more time and energy to elaborate on. Let's just say that it's worth academic-level research and could be treated as a minor form of literature. Final Fantasy IV is playable in at least some form on just about all modern consoles. Think about it. Also be sure to factor in the systems with backwards compatibility and peripherals that allow them to play other games. The other systems that I know that can't play this game are all the Sega systems and the Xboxes. However, both the Dreamcast and the original Xbox can be modified to play it. We've pretty much covered the SNES version. Awesome stuff, faulty numbering, a few mistranslations, but what came next? Final Fantasy IV was not an easy game. Even Japanese gamers found it frustrating as Final Fantasy IV Easy Type was released. Basically, it just made the game easier for people that would rather enjoy the story. After a new set of consoles appeared, Final Fantasy waved goodbye to their Nintendo friends and jumped ship to Sony with no fear of Leviathan. This is where Final Fantasy became a staple in the game collections of millions, as the PlayStation had almost the entire franchise available up to that point. The PlayStation version of Final Fantasy IV offered a few changes. For starters, the game began with an awesome cutscene, recreating the story's opening. Not only that, but players could now sprint through towns and dungeons, allowing those familiar with the game to progress faster. Players could also create temporary save states anywhere on the map, provided they don't forget to save before a game over screen. The PlayStation version was later packaged with Chrono Trigger as Final Fantasy Chronicles, essentially putting two of the best games ever in a single case. Due to the popularity of the Game Boy in America, the WonderSwan Color version of Final Fantasy IV often goes under the radar. In fact, Square was one of the lead developers for the system, even going as far as releasing a bundle with the original Final Fantasy. There were quite a few graphical changes to the game for this version. Smaller resolution forced images to be more compact, making for a better design in some situations, but unfortunately these versions of the games were only released in Japanese. Expanding on the graphical enhancements of the WonderSwan version, Final Fantasy IV Advance sported some of the best quality 16-bit had to offer. Each of the sprites popped with new life, and Nobuo Uematsu's music sounded even better than before. Much of the script had also been improved in hopes that the complex plot would be delivered more efficiently. This version was also the first to expand on the original game. 2 new areas were developed for expanded gameplay, allowing players to get new items and be challenged to the limit. This version is one of my favorites, despite the flaws in the battle system, and some of which can break the game's fairness, but it's not really noticeable to casual players. Probably the version with the most drastic changes is Final Fantasy IV DS. The sprites were replaced with full 3D models, the script was overhauled to include minor but powerful details, and voice acting was added.
It's large! This one too!
Several new fully rendered videos were added as well, giving the game a visual appeal beyond most DS games. Players could also summon a new Eidolon named White, whose face could be altered via the touchscreen. Fat Chocobo, who was before an obese item bank, is now the lord of minigames that can boost White's stats. White can also be pit against another White via the wireless functionality of the system. It's like Pokemon, but with just one creature. Personally, I found White to be mostly useless. He's not as cool as the other summons, even though with enough minigames he could be better. White is lame, which is why he was taken out of the mobile and PC versions of this game. Another major change was the difficulty of the game itself. Many of the bosses will not hold back their ultimate attacks, often dumping them on the party at the start of a battle. This can be incredibly frustrating at times. In fact, I quit playing the DS version due to a seemingly impossible battle. Luckily, many of the time-altering spells are more effective, and knowledge of how each spell works in relation to the specific situation is paramount for success. I do not recommend this version for new players. Changing up the game's overall style, the PSP version swaps out the pixelated heroes for a more hand-drawn style. The whole game is modeled after the anniversary versions of Final Fantasy 1 and 2, which were both excellent remakes. Couple this with all the updated dungeons plus 2 sequel games, and this release becomes the most complete version of the game. Players familiar with the core game could also skip into the new content, which is an excellent feature. Nostalgic players could also switch the audio to the original SNES music. While the additions of everything Final Fantasy IV have to offer are awesome, it needs to be said that the plot of After Years is a bit of a letdown. Sure, the children of the former characters are an understandable addition to the story. Many novels, movies, anime, and more follow the same trope, but it just doesn't seem as cool. Of course, anything involving Rydia is a welcome sight, so I was down for it. The DS version was later released on mobile devices and Steam. These versions omit some things like White, and add a few whistles like achievements and cloud-based saving. Overall, there aren't a whole lot of changes in these versions compared to the DS, but the ability of playing the game on a PC or an iPhone is always a plus. After many re-releases, alternate versions, and sequel games, Final Fantasy IV stays awesome in all forms. While its tropes and plots may seem archaic compared to the major role-playing games of today, gamers of all walks will have some fun with it. The art style is iconic. The characters fit specific roles in combat, and were more complex than most characters at the time. Battling monsters is smooth, and builds upon itself as the game progresses, and more options are unlocked. The story is on the level of a full novel, taking the player from an unfortunate situation to the moon to save the world. Few games have reached this level of excellence, making Final Fantasy IV in any version an absolute classic. Now, if only some of the other Final Fantasy games could get such drastic overhauls. Final Fantasy VII, please?